She agreed to be a maid but didn't know she'd be serving the most powerful duke in England and that it would change everything. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave your city in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Now let's get to the story. London and Thornfield Manor, Surrey, England, year 1862. October. Rain lashed against the Pemberton home's window panes like bitter tears from a grieving sky. Catherine adjusted the wool shawl over her shoulders, watching the drops trace winding paths down the fogged glass. She didn't yet know that these would be the last peaceful moments of her 20-year-old life. The scent of bergamot still lingered in the living room when her father, Edmund Pemberton, emerged from the study with a face as grey as the stones of the Thames. In his hands, crumpled papers trembled like autumn leaves about to fall. "Catherine?" His voice sounded hollow, distant, like an echo from a deep well. She turned, and in that instant, she knew that something fundamental had broken. Her father's eyes, once affectionate, now gazed at her with a coldness that chilled her to the bone. Lady Constance Ashworth, her aunt, watched from the velvet armchair like a bird of prey, awaiting the exact moment to strike. "The deeds to the Whitmore property have disappeared," Edmund murmured, his words falling like stones into still water. "And our competitors already know information that only our family possessed." The silence that followed was as dense as a shroud. Catherine felt the ground move beneath her feet, but her dignity kept her upright like an oak tree enduring a storm. "Father, I would never—" "The evidence is clear, niece," Lady Constance interrupted, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "Your nocturnal escapades, your conversations with strangers at the market, even your French education made you suspect to some." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the world crumble like sandcastles, touched by the tide. When she opened them again, she found only a void where her father's love had once been. The sentence came as a mortal whisper. She was to leave at dawn, taking only what would fit in a single suitcase. Her name would be erased from the family records as if she had never existed. That night, as she packed her few possessions, Catherine held against her chest the only photograph she had of her deceased mother. The image seemed to whisper to her that truth, like spring, always finds a way to blossom, even in the harshest winter. But who could have imagined that Mrs. Martha Henley, her mother's former governess, would appear in the early morning like a guardian angel, offering her a position at a distant mansion called Thornfield Manor. Autumn was gilding the leaves of Surrey when Catherine's carriage wound down the cobblestone road leading to Thornfield Manor. The Georgian mansion rose majestically among ancient oaks, its towers pointing to the sky like fingers, begging for forgiveness from the gods. The blackwood coat of arms, carved in marble over the main portal, displayed a rampant lion and an intertwined rose, symbols of strength and delicacy united in an eternal dance. Catherine instinctively touched her mother's locket, feeling that destiny was weaving invisible threads around her soul. Mr. Harold Ashford, the butler, greeted her with respectful courtesy. His silver hair and kind eyes reminded her of the father who had once loved her. Sarah Mills, a maid with rosy cheeks and a shy smile, led her through the dark wood corridors, where ancestral portraits seemed to whisper stories of bygone times. "His lordship is in the library," Sarah murmured, nervously adjusting the folds of her apron. "Lord James rarely receives visitors since—" The sentence hung in the air like unburned incense. Catherine understood that there were mysteries within these walls, secrets guarded like treasures in sealed coffers. The library revealed itself as a sanctuary of knowledge, with shelves that reached the vaulted ceiling. The scent of aged leather and ancient paper enveloped Catherine like a familiar embrace. Among the dancing shadows cast by the fireplace, a male figure took shape. Lord James Blackwood emerged from the gloom like an apparition, hair as black as night, contrasted with grey-blue eyes that held oceanic depths. He wore strict mourning attire, but there was a melancholic elegance in his posture that touched Catherine's heart like a pianist's fingers on sensitive keys. They stared at each other in silence, and in that first meeting of gazes, something indescribable moved between them, subtle as the scent of roses on the wind, powerful as the moon's pull on the tides. "Miss Pemberton," his voice was deep, musically sad, "Mrs. Henley has told me of your qualifications. The library needs organizing, and the orphaned children on the estate need an education." Catherine inclined her head gracefully, feeling that in that moment, her true life was beginning. She didn't yet know that those stormy eyes would hold both her salvation and her greatest trial. As the afternoon died in shades of amber and violet, Catherine settled into the East Tower room, where the window framed fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. For the first time in weeks, she felt something akin to hope sprout in her chest, like seeds after the rain. But what she didn't see was the shadow that moved between the curtains in the main wing, nor the eyes that watched her with dangerous interest as the crescent moon rose over Thornfield. Winter arrived at Thornfield like a silent visitor, painting the gardens in silver and crystal. Catherine had found her calling among the ancient books and the orphaned children who came to the mansion for lessons. Small faces lit up when she told stories of distant lands, her fingers tracing imaginary maps in the air, scented by the fireplace fire. Sarah Mills had become her confidant, bringing hot tea on chilly afternoons and whispering stories about the inhabitants of Thornfield. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, the rosy-faced cook, spoiled Catherine with spiced cakes that tasted of maternal affection. It was while reorganizing the medieval manuscripts that Catherine found the letters. They were hidden between the pages of a treatise on astronomy, written in a delicate feminine hand. They were from Lady Isabel Blackwood, James's deceased wife, addressed to a mysterious recipient. "Dear Margaret, I fear my suspicions about Constance are true. She has been visiting Frederick with excessive frequency, and there are whispered conversations about inheritances and documents. James doesn't believe my concern, but a woman can sense when danger is lurking around her home." Catherine's hands trembled as she read, "Lady Constance, her own aunt." A chill that had nothing to do with winter ran down her spine. The pieces of a sinister puzzle were beginning to fit together, forming an image that terrified her. That same afternoon, while walking through the snow-covered gardens to clear her thoughts, Catherine nearly collided with Lord James near the dormant rose garden. He was carrying white roses, Isabel's favourites, Sarah had told her. "Forgive me, my lord," she murmured, lowering her eyes. But James was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. There was such profound sadness in him that Catherine felt the urge to touch him, to offer him the comfort her words dared not express. "Miss Pemberton, Catherine," his voice sounded different, closer. "I've observed your work with the children. There's something about you, a light that this house hasn't seen in a long time." They walked side by side in silence, leaving parallel footprints in the virgin snow. Catherine felt torn between the joy of being near him and the terror of the discoveries she had made. Should she tell him about the letters? Could she trust him completely? When they reached the wrought iron gate that bordered the main garden, James stopped and turned to her. For a moment it seemed as though he would say something important, something that would change everything between them. But then, like clouds covering the sun, his expression closed off again. "Good afternoon, Miss Pemberton," he said formally, walking away with quick steps. Catherine stood alone among the bare rose bushes, holding Isabel's letters against her chest as if they were burning embers. The winter wind murmured through the dry branches, carrying omens she did not yet know how to interpret. That night, as the candles flickered in her tower room, Catherine decided she would keep her discovery secret until she fully understood its importance. She had no idea that Lady Constance was already planning a visit to Thornfield, nor that her days of peace were numbered, like grains of sand in an hourglass about to run out. The December fog enveloped Thornfield like a veil of mystery when Lady Constance Ashworth arrived in her ornate carriage, announcing plans for a winter ball. Catherine watched from the library window as her aunt alighted with exaggerated pomp, her peacock blue silks contrasting with the mansion's melancholic simplicity. "My dear James," her voice echoed through the entrance hall like chiming crystal. "This house needs life again. Isabel would be horrified to see you pining away like this." Catherine recoiled from the window, her heart racing. Lady Constance's proximity brought back all the anxieties of London, as if a storm were approaching a safe harbour. Over the next few days, the mansion transformed into a hive of activity. Florists arrived from London carrying white camellias and winter roses. Seamstresses took over the East Wing, crafting decorations. Catherine retreated more and more into the library, but she couldn't escape her aunt's penetrating gaze. "My dear niece," Lady Constance appeared one afternoon among the shelves, her kid gloves gliding over the spines of books. "What a coincidence to find you here. I hope you aren't causing embarrassment to the Earl." There was poison in her sweet words, a veiled threat that made Catherine shiver. But she remained dignified, raising her chin with delicacy. "I am merely performing my duties, Aunt. Lord James has been nothing but correct." "Ah, but correctness is not always enough, is it?" Lady Constance smiled like a snake before it strikes. Widowed men are vulnerable creatures. It would be terrible if someone took advantage of his fragility. On the night of the ball, Thornfield shone like a fairy tale palace. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows on the walls, and the scent of gardenias competed with the perfume of the guests. Catherine, wearing a simple grey wool dress, watched from the service staircase as Surrey aristocracy danced in hypnotic movements. James, impeccable in his evening suit, greeted the ladies introduced by Lady Constance. Catherine noticed how he avoided her gaze, as if her presence was both desired and feared. It was during the waltz that everything fell apart. Lady Constance, radiant in embroidered taffeta, raised her voice above the music. "I must alert our dear friends," she announced theatrically, "to the presence of a person of questionable reputation among us. Miss Catherine Pemberton was expelled from her home for theft and seducing masters. I fear our dear Isabel would be turning in her grave knowing that such a creature is profaning her former residence." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine felt every gaze pierce her like a dagger. Tears burned in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Dignity was all she had left. Then something unexpected happened. James walked to the staircase, climbed a few steps, and offered her his arm. "Miss Pemberton, would you grant me the honor of this dance?" His voice echoed clear and defiant. The ballroom held its breath. Catherine looked into those stormy eyes and saw something that made her heart race. It was not just courtesy, but something much deeper and more dangerous. As they descended together to the ballroom, and he led her to the center of the floor, every movement of the waltz became a silent declaration. The whispers of the guests mingled with the music, but Catherine only heard the quickened rhythm of her own heart. "Ignore them," James murmured, his breath touching her ear. "You are worth more than all of them put together." But when the music ended and he accompanied her to the door, Catherine saw a dark promise in Lady Constance's eyes. This battle was only beginning, and the next blow would be far more devastating. The fire began in the early hours of January, when snow covered Thornfield like a deceptive mantle of purity. Catherine awoke to the acrid smell of smoke seeping into her tower room. From the window she saw orange tongues licking the stones of the east wing, where the Blackwood family archives were kept. Without hesitation, she wrapped herself in her robe and ran through the corridors. The fire was voraciously consuming centuries-old documents, but Catherine noticed that the flames followed a strange pattern. They were concentrated specifically on the archives concerning Lady Isabel and the properties inherited by James. "What are you doing here?" James appeared running, his face lit by the orange reflections. There was despair in his eyes as he watched decades of family history turn to ashes. "There's something I need to save." Catherine plunged into the smoke, ignoring the heat that seared her eyelids. Her hands searched frantically among the still intact papers. It was then that she heard muffled crying. In an adjacent room, little Mary, one of the orphans who attended lessons, was huddled behind an armchair, too terrified to move. Catherine didn't think twice. She carried the girl in her arms and, along with a bundle of salvaged documents, ran to safety. James received them in the garden, his eyes revealing a mix of admiration and something deeper that made Catherine's heart flutter, even in the midst of the chaos. "You risked your life," he murmured, his hands gently touching her face to check if she was hurt. "Why?" Catherine looked at him in silence, unable to explain that she would risk much more than her life for him and for those innocent children. Little Mary clung to his neck, sobbing softly. Later, when the fire was brought under control by the estate men, Catherine examined the documents she had managed to save. Among them, she discovered correspondences that chilled her blood. Letters from Frederick Ashworth, Lady Constance's brother, discussing with Isabel the inheritance of Thornfield and mentioning alternative methods if she didn't cooperate. One letter in particular left her breathless. "Isabel has become too obstinate. Her suspicions about our plans grow daily. Perhaps it is time to accelerate our strategy. A well-planned accident would solve all our problems." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the terrible weight of the truth. Isabel's death had not been an accident. It had been a cold, calculated murder. And now, her own presence at Thornfield threatened to expose this deadly secret. When she showed the letters to James the next morning, he was silent for long minutes, his hands trembling imperceptibly. The pain in his eyes was so intense that Catherine felt the urge to hug him, to share the burden he had carried for so long. "I always knew something was wrong," he finally confessed, his voice as rough as ground glass. "Isabel was terrified in the weeks before. She died. She talked about leaving for London, about taking evidence to a lawyer. I thought they were just unfounded fears of a pregnant woman. Pregnant? Catherine felt as if the ground were moving beneath her feet. 3 months. James closed his eyes, the pain ethereal in every word. She was carrying my heir when the carriage plunged into the gorge. In that moment, Catherine understood the magnitude of the crime. They had not only murdered Isabel, but also the child who could have continued the Blackwood lineage and threatened the Ashworths' inheritance plans. What neither of them noticed was the shadow that moved behind the library curtains, nor that every word of their conversation had been carefully overheard by ears that were already planning the next and most devastating blow. Spring came timidly to Thornfield, but it brought with it a palpable tension that hung over the mansion like morning mist. Catherine felt invisible eyes watching her every move, every conversation with James, every moment of shared silence. Lady Constance had settled into one of the main suites, claiming that the London social season was unbearably monotonous. Her presence had transformed the mansion's serene atmosphere into a dance of shadows and whispers. "My dear Catherine," she appeared one afternoon while Catherine was organizing natural history books, "I've noticed that you and James have developed a worrying familiarity. As your aunt, I feel obligated to warn you about the dangers of nurturing inappropriate hopes." There was something in Lady Constance's eyes that made Catherine instinctively recoil, like an animal sensing the proximity of a predator. But she maintained her dignity, answering in a serene voice, "I don't know what you're talking about, Aunt. I maintain only professional relations with his lordship." "Ah, but the heart is a traitor, isn't it?" Lady Constance slid her gloves along the books with feigned nonchalance. "And widowed men are especially vulnerable to improper consolations." That same night, during dinner, Catherine noticed how Lady Constance skillfully steered the conversation to topics that highlighted the social differences between her and James. She talked about balls in London, advantageous marriages, the importance of aristocratic lineage, each word a subtle blade cutting away at Catherine's possibilities. "Isabel always said that Thornfield needed a lady worthy of its history," she commented, seemingly innocently while James silently poured wine for himself. "Someone who understood the responsibilities that come with ancient titles." Catherine kept her eyes down, pretending to concentrate on her soup, but she felt every word like a cold slap. James, in turn, seemed distant, lost in thoughts she couldn't decipher. It was the next morning that the fatal blow was delivered. Sarah Mills appeared in Catherine's room with tears in her eyes and hands trembling like leaves in the wind. "Miss Catherine, please tell me this isn't true," the young maid sobbed, holding something wrapped in linen fabric. When the fabric was unwrapped, Catherine felt the world crumble. There was Lady Isabel's diamond brooch, the most precious piece of her collection, supposedly found among Catherine's belongings. Where did you find this?" Catherine whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Lady Constance found it in your underwear drawer." Sarah was crying openly now. "She already called Mr. Ashford and, oh, Miss Catherine, they're saying you stole from the memory of the late Countess." The room spun around Catherine. She immediately understood the cruel genius of the trap. They weren't just accusing her of common theft, but of profaning the sacred memory of a dead woman, a crime that Victorian society would never forgive. When Lord James appeared at the bedroom door, Catherine saw in his eyes the death of all the trust they had built. There was pain there, betrayal, a coldness that struck her like a precise dagger. "Miss Pemberton," his voice was formal again, distant as winter stars. "I'm afraid you must accompany me to the study. There are matters that need to be cleared up." Catherine rose with all the dignity she could muster. She knew that protesting would be useless, that the evidence had been planted with diabolical mastery. But there was something in her green eyes that remained untamed, the flame of innocence that no slander in the world could extinguish. As she walked through the corridors for the last time as a free woman, Catherine carried in her heart the terrible certainty that Lady Constance had finally achieved what she had always desired, to destroy her completely, using even the memory of a dead woman as a weapon. But what neither of them knew was that Sarah Mills had seen something that dawn, a furtive shadow moving through the corridors, a figure she had recognized but had not dared to report until that moment. The local Surrey prison was a damp stone building that smelled of desperation and regret. Catherine spent 3 days in a cold cell, sustained only by the fragile hope that the truth would find a way to emerge from the shadows. Sarah Mills appeared on the afternoon of the 3rd day, her eyes red from crying so much, carrying a basket with fresh bread and words that would change everything. "Miss Catherine," she whispered through the bars, looking nervously around. That night, I saw Lady Constance leaving your room at 2 in the morning. I thought it was just my imagination. But now, Sarah, Catherine held the young woman's cold hands through the iron bars. Are you absolutely sure? On my soul, miss, she was carrying something small wrapped in fabric. When they found the brooch, I knew immediately. But I was so afraid to accuse a lady. At that same moment at Thornfield, James was walking through the gardens like a tormented man. The private investigator he had hired, Mr. Edmund Hartwell, had brought discoveries that made his world shake to its foundations. Lord James, Hartwell said, consulting his notes. The evidence is disturbing. Lady Constance and her brother Frederick have considerable debts in London. The Thornfield inheritance would be more than enough to save them from ruin. Continue. James's voice sounded as dry as dead leaves. There's more. I found the coachman who was supposed to have driven Lady Isabel's carriage on that fatal day. He was suddenly dismissed the morning of the accident and replaced by an unknown man who disappeared soon after. The original coachman is willing to testify in exchange for protection. When James confronted Lady Constance that same night, the mask of courtesy finally fell. She was in the music room, idly fingering the keys of the piano that Isabel used to play. Ah, dear James, she said without turning around, I imagine you've come to discuss the arrangements for your protégé's trial. I'm afraid the evidence is irrefutable. Constance. His voice carried a chilling authority. I know what you did to Isabel, and I know Catherine is innocent. Lady Constance turned slowly, and James saw a cruelty in her eyes that made him shiver. There was no more pretense, only the naked and terrible truth. Isabel was too stubborn, she said in a dangerously calm voice. She found out about our financial arrangements, threatened to expose everything, and that baby, that cursed baby that would secure her position forever. You admit it, James murmured, horrified. You admit to having murdered my wife and my child. I admit that I solved a problem. Lady Constance rose, majestic in her wickedness. And now I'm solving another. Catherine Pemberton will be hanged for theft and profanation, and you will marry a suitable lady whom I will choose. Thornfield will remain in the family under my guidance. But Lady Constance had underestimated the determination of a man who had lost everything and had finally discovered the truth. James had already sent evidence to the authorities, had already secured protected witnesses. The next morning, when the officers arrived at Thornfield to arrest Lady Constance, she tried one last desperate gambit. She claimed that Catherine had blackmailed her, that everything had been orchestrated by the young woman to win over James, but there was too much evidence against her now. Frederick's letters, the coachman's testimony, Sarah Mills's declarations. One by one, her lies crumbled like sandcastles touched by the tide of justice. As Lady Constance was led away in handcuffs, her eyes met those of Catherine, who had been released and was waiting at the main door of Thornfield. In that look was a dark promise of revenge, but also the bitter defeat of someone who had bet everything and lost. Catherine, in turn, felt strangely empty. Justice had triumphed, but the price paid in pain and distrust seemed too high. She looked at James, who was approaching slowly, and saw in his stormy eyes a silent question that she still didn't know if she was ready to answer. The Surrey courthouse had never witnessed such a dramatic scene. Lady Constance Ashworth, who had once been the epitome of aristocratic elegance, was now in the defendant's box with a face as pale as marble and the empty eyes of someone who had seen all their plans crumble. Catherine sat in the front row, not as an accused, but as a witness to justice. Beside her, James maintained a rigid posture, but she could feel the tension emanating from him like heat from a forge. The judge, Lord Pembrokeshire, a white-haired man with piercing eyes, read the sentence in a solemn voice. Lady Constance Ashworth, for conspiracy to murder, premeditated murder, and attempted destruction of evidence, is sentenced to life imprisonment. A murmur ran through the room. Catherine closed her eyes, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been done, but so many lives had been shattered along the way. As they left the courthouse, James stopped on the marble steps and turned to Catherine. The afternoon sun gilded her hair and highlighted the vulnerability in his grey-blue eyes. Catherine, his voice sounded different, softer, almost trembling. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. She waited in silence, her heart beating like a hummingbird's wings. Around them, the city's movement continued, but in that moment, there were only the two of them and the unspoken words that hung in the air like promises. During these terrible months, when I doubted you, when I let suspicion poison my feelings. I discovered something that changed everything, James approached, and Catherine could see the reflection of his contained tears in his eyes. I discovered that I had fallen madly in love with you. The world seemed to stop. Catherine felt her legs grow weak, as if all strength had been drained from her body. James, she whispered, but he continued, the words gushing like water from a broken dam. I know I'm a man haunted by the past. I know our social difference represents immense obstacles, but he hesitated, then raised his voice, allowing everyone in the courthouse courtyard to hear. Catherine Pemberton, will you marry me? The silence that followed was absolute. Passers-by stopped. Coachmen ceased their conversations. Even the birds seemed to suspend their songs. Catherine looked around, seeing curious and scandalized faces, whispers that were already beginning to spread like ripples on a quiet lake. Are you sure? She murmured, tears finally released rolling down her face. After everything that has happened, after all the suspicions, I'm sure that you are the bravest, most dignified and purest woman I have ever known. James took her hands in his, kissing them reverently. I'm sure that Isabel would approve of our union, for you have saved not only my life but my soul. Catherine looked into his eyes and saw not just love, but redemption. She saw a future where the pain of the past could be transformed into hope, where two wounded souls could heal each other. Yes, she said, her voice as clear as crystal. Yes, I will marry you. The kiss they shared on the courthouse steps became a legend in Surrey. They said there had never been a display of love so pure, so defiant of social conventions, so courageous in its simplicity. 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony in the Thornfield Chapel, Catherine Pemberton became Catherine Blackwood. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Sarah Mills with love and care. James was radiant, as if years of sadness had been washed from his soul. In the front row, the orphaned children from the estate watched with eyes shining with joy. Mr. Ashford cried discreetly, and Mrs. Fletcher had prepared a feast fit for kings. When the Reverend pronounced the words that declared them husband and wife, Catherine felt that she was not just marrying James, but a new life, a new identity, a new destiny. But as they celebrated, neither of them imagined that Lady Constance in her damp cell was weaving dark plans of revenge that would extend far beyond the bars of her prison. The summer of 1863 brought a tranquility to Thornfield that the mansion hadn't known for years. Catherine, now Lady Blackwood, had gradually transformed the property into a true home. The corridors echoed with children's laughter again. The garden was re-blossoming under her dedicated care, and James seemed to be reborn with each passing day. In the mornings, Catherine would often walk through the gardens with a lace shawl over her shoulders, watching the roses she had planted in the spring bloom in shades of coral and ivory. James often accompanied her, and they had developed the habit of sharing comfortable silences while planning improvements for the property. The village children need more education, Catherine commented on one of these walks, stopping by the rose garden where they had first met. I thought of expanding our programs, maybe building a small school near the property. James smiled, that rare and precious smile that she had learned to value like a rough diamond. You just can't stop taking care of others, can you? He said, gently touching a rose she herself had planted. It's one of the things I love most about you. Catherine blushed slightly. Even after months of marriage, James's displays of affection still made her feel like a young woman in love for the first time. That afternoon, while organizing correspondence in the library, Catherine found a letter that chilled her blood. It was from Mr. Hartwell, the private investigator, informing her that Lady Constance had died in prison under suspicious circumstances. Next to her, they found an unfinished letter addressed to associates in London, mentioning plans for the final destruction of the Blackwoods. Catherine quickly hid the letter when she heard footsteps approaching. James entered, carrying a bundle of legal documents, his face radiating a contained excitement. Catherine, I have news, he said, approaching the table where she was working. I managed to recover all the properties that Frederick and Constance tried to usurp. Thornfield is finally free of their clutches. She forced a smile, deciding not to spoil that moment of joy with concerns about mysterious letters. There would be time for serious discussions later. That's wonderful, my dear, she said sincerely. Now we can implement all our plans for the children and the community. It was that night, as they were dining in the intimate room that Catherine had transformed into a cozy refuge, that she found the courage to share a piece of news she had kept for weeks. James, she began hesitantly, nervously fiddling with her mother's locket. There's something I need to tell you. He looked up from the documents he was reviewing, immediately noticing the change in her voice. "What is it, my love? You've seemed different for a few days." Catherine took a deep breath, feeling a mix of joy and apprehension. "I'm expecting a baby," she said simply, watching as the information gradually reflected in his face. The silence that followed was absolute. James remained motionless for long moments, as if trying to process the magnitude of that revelation. Then, slowly, a smile illuminated his face, like a dawn after the darkest night. "A baby," he repeated, marveling. "Our child." He got up and walked to her, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands with infinite reverence. "You have given me everything, Catherine," he murmured, kissing her palms. "You have restored my capacity to love, brought life to this house, and now you offer me the miracle of a new generation." Catherine felt tears of happiness burn in her eyes. In that moment, with James kneeling before her and the promise of new life growing in her womb, she felt that all the pain of the past had been worth it. But outside, in the garden's shadows, a figure watched the scene through the lit window. Lady Constance's associates in London had not forgotten the Blackwoods, and dark plans were already in motion. Catherine and James's happiness was about to be tested once more, but this time they would face the storms together, like a tree with intertwined roots resisting the fiercest winds. Autumn arrived early at Thornfield that year of 1863, tinging the leaves with melancholic gold and bringing with it unexpected visitors. Catherine, now 6 months pregnant, felt both full and vulnerable, like a flower about to blossom in a hostile season. It was during one of those rainy afternoons, while she was supervising the orphan children's lessons in the library, converted into a study room, that Mr. Ashford appeared with a worried expression. "Lady Catherine," he said discreetly, "gentlemen from London have arrived requesting an audience with his lordship. They claim to represent legal interests related to the Ashworth estate." Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine. Since Lady Constance's death in prison, she had hoped that the past would finally rest in peace, but it seemed that the shadows had a life of their own. The two men waiting in the drawing room exuded an atmosphere that chilled Catherine's blood. Mr. Cornelius Blackthorne was thin as a stick, with small calculating eyes that seemed to evaluate the value of every object in the room. His companion, Mr. Augustus Grimsby, was plump and had an oily smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lady Blackwood," Blackthorne said in a syrupy voice, "we deeply regret the misfortune that befell Lady Constance. We were her financial consultants in London." Catherine remained composed, one hand protectively on her belly. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid there are no pending matters between our family and the Ashworths. All legal documents have been resolved by the courts." "Ah, but there are certain commitments," Grimsby said, pulling a leather folder from his briefcase. "Contracts signed by the late Lady Constance that transfer rights to certain Blackwood properties as collateral for substantial loans." Catherine's hands trembled imperceptibly. "Which properties?" "Thornfield Manor," Blackthorne said with cruel satisfaction, "and all the fortune associated with the title. Lady Constance gambled everything on a commercial venture that did not yield the expected results." It was at that moment that James entered the room, alerted by Mr. Ashford. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere's dynamic, as if an alpha wolf had entered a hyena's territory. "Gentlemen," his voice carried a chilling authority, "explain to me exactly what you are insinuating." Blackthorne and Grimsby exchanged nervous glances, but maintained their pretense. They presented documents that they claimed proved Lady Constance had used Thornfield as collateral for loans intended for speculation in the colonies. "Naturally," Grimsby said with false sympathy, "we understand that the situation is delicate, especially considering her ladyship's interesting condition. We would be willing to negotiate reasonable terms for the debt repayment." James examined the documents with a hawk's eye. Catherine watched as his muscles tensed, as his eyes narrowed. She knew that expression. It was the same one he had had when he discovered the truth about Isabel's death. "Interesting," James said finally, handing the papers back, "except for the fact that Lady Constance never had the legal authority to use Thornfield as collateral. The property has belonged entirely to the Blackwoods for generations, without any connection to the Ashworth's assets." "But the contract," Blackthorne began. "Are fake," James finished coldly, "and extremely poorly forged, I might add. The seal used is from a notary who died 2 years before the alleged date of these documents." The silence that followed was as tense as a violin string about to snap. Catherine saw desperation begin to seep into the eyes of the two men, replacing the confidence they had previously displayed. "Gentlemen," James said, walking to the door and holding it open, "I suggest you leave immediately. And don't bother to return. Any future communication should be directed through my lawyers in London." After the men left in a hurry, Catherine sank into an armchair, feeling the baby stir restlessly in her womb, as if it had sensed the tension of the moment. "They'll be back," she murmured. "Somehow they'll come back with something worse." James knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I will not allow anything or anyone to threaten you or our child," he said with an iron determination. "The ghosts of the past have already caused enough pain to our family." But as he spoke, James did not see the shadow that moved quickly past the window, nor did he realize that Blackthorne and Grimsby's plans were just beginning. Lady Constance's revenge would continue through them, like poison distilled for generations. The winter of 1864 arrived with an unusual fury, bringing snowstorms that isolated Thornfield from the outside world for weeks. Catherine, now in her 8th month of pregnancy, felt simultaneously full and vulnerable, like a flower about to blossom in a hostile season. It was during one of these storms that the letters began to arrive. The first was delivered by a messenger who nearly froze on his way to the mansion, his clothes covered in ice and his lips blue with cold. James read the correspondence in silence, his face hardening like marble as his eyes scanned the lines. Catherine, embroidering clothes for the baby by the fireplace, noticed the change in his posture. "What is it, my dear?" she asked softly, never ceasing the delicate movement of her needle. "Nothing that should concern you," James replied, but she knew that tone. It was the same one he had used when he tried to protect her from the first suspicions about her aunt's accusations. Catherine put down her embroidery and held out her hand. "James, we promised not to have secrets from each other. What does that letter say?" Reluctantly, he approached and sat beside her on the blue velvet sofa. The letter was from Lord Pemberton, an acquaintance of the London aristocracy. "Dear James, I feel compelled to inform you about disturbing rumours circulating in the capital's salons. They say that Lady Catherine maintained secret correspondence with political radicals before her marriage, and that her presence at Thornfield is related to conspiracies against the Crown. While I personally give no credit to such allegations, I fear that others are taking them seriously." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. It was the same strategy as always, to harm her through slanders that were impossible to completely refute. "Blackthorne and Grimsby," she murmured. "They're spreading lies when they couldn't destroy us legally." In the following weeks, more letters arrived. Each one brought new, more elaborate and more dangerous rumours. They said Catherine was a French spy, that she seduced aristocratic men to extract military secrets, that her marriage to James was a political coup orchestrated by enemies of England. The tension at Thornfield became palpable, the servants whispered among themselves. Some of the suppliers began to question their accounts, and even the local vicar seemed distant during his last visit. It was on a particularly stormy night that Catherine felt the first contractions. She was in the library trying to distract herself with a book of poetry when a familiar yet new pain shot through her womb like a lightning bolt. "James!" she called, her voice echoing through the corridors. He appeared running, still wearing the riding clothes he had used to check on the stables. When he saw Catherine's pale face and her hands pressed against her belly, he understood immediately. "The baby," she whispered. "It's coming." The storm outside mirrored Catherine's internal chaos. The contractions came in increasingly intense waves, while Mrs. Fletcher and Sarah rushed to prepare the main room. The village doctor was unable to arrive due to the snowstorm, leaving only the experience of Mrs. Dorothy, who had helped with the births of several women in the region. During the long hours of labour, Catherine clung to James's hand, as if it were her only anchor in reality. Between the waves of pain, he whispered words of encouragement and love, promising that he would protect both her and the child from any storm the world brought. "No matter what they say about us," he murmured, kissing her sweaty forehead, "our truth is stronger than all the lies in the world." When the sun rose over Thornfield, painting the snow in pink and gold, the first cries of a baby echoed through the mansion. Catherine held a perfect little boy in her arms, with dark hair like his father's, and eyes that promised to inherit his mother's oceanic green. "Thomas," she said softly, looking at James with tears of joy. "Thomas Blackwood, after my grandfather." James kissed first his wife, then his son's small forehead, feeling that all the world's persecution and slander were insignificant in the face of the miracle they had created together. But outside, even as the family rejoiced, a messenger was riding through the melting snow, carrying the news of the birth to ears that awaited it with sinister interest. The campaign to destroy the Blackwoods was about to enter its final phase. The spring of 1864 brought a treacherous beauty to Thornfield. The gardens bloomed lushly under Catherine's care, but the atmosphere of tension was almost palpable, like air charged before a devastating storm. Little Thomas, now 3 months old, was the light of the mansion. His crystal laughter echoed through the corridors, and Catherine never tired of watching James hold his son with infinite reverence, as if he were carrying the most precious treasure in the world. It was on a May morning, while Catherine was breastfeeding Thomas in the rose garden, that Mr. Ashford appeared with an expression she had learned to fear. "Lady Catherine," he said hesitantly, "officers from London have arrived. They are carrying a search warrant issued by the Home Office." Catherine's heart raced, but she kept her voice serene. "Searching for what, Mr. Ashford?" "Documents that prove seditious activities against the Crown." He seemed ashamed just to utter the words. Catherine kissed Thomas's soft forehead and handed him to Sarah, who was waiting nervously by the rose bushes. "Where is James?" "He rode to the village to resolve matters for the new school. He won't return before nightfall." Catherine took a deep breath, raising her chin with the dignity that had become her hallmark. "Then I will receive the officers alone." Captain Howick was a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes that seemed to have seen too much injustice disguised as duty. He was accompanied by 2 young soldiers who avoided Catherine's gaze. "Lady Blackwood," the captain said, clearly uncomfortable, "I regret this embarrassment, but there are serious allegations about correspondence with foreign agents and activities against national interests." "I understand, Captain," Catherine replied with a serenity that surprised him. "You may search the property at will. We have nothing to hide." For 2 hours the men ransacked every room, every drawer, every book in the library. Catherine accompanied them in silence, Thomas in her arms, watching as they examined her private life with the gloves of official protocol. It was in James's personal study that they found what they had clearly been instructed to look for: forged letters with her name, written in a crude imitation of her handwriting, addressed to addresses in France, and containing information about English military movements. "These letters," Captain Harwick began, but Catherine interrupted him. "I have never written these correspondences," she said with crystalline firmness. "The handwriting may be similar, but it is not mine, and if you examine them carefully you will discover that the paper and ink are different from what I habitually use." The captain studied the documents with an experienced eye. Catherine saw in him the struggle between official duty and the personal intuition that something was wrong. "Lady Blackwood," he said finally, "I must fulfill my mission. These letters constitute evidence of treason. I will have to take you to London for questioning." Catherine felt the world sway, but Thomas in her arms kept her centered in reality. "Captain, may I make a request?" "That depends on the nature of the request." "My son is still nursing. Would you allow him to accompany me at least until you arrange for a wet nurse?" Her voice almost broke on the last word. Captain Harwick looked at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, oblivious to the storm forming around him. For a moment, his official mask fell, revealing the father he probably was. "That can be arranged," he said softly, "but understand that the situation is grave. Treason against the Crown is a capital crime." When James returned at nightfall, he found Thornfield empty of its most precious life. The note that Catherine had managed to leave with Sarah said only, "Do not lose faith in our truth. Love always finds a way back home." He held the paper with trembling hands, feeling that the world was again trying to tear away everything he loved. But this time would be different. This time he would fight with every weapon he possessed. In the London prison, Catherine rocked Thomas against her chest, whispering lullabies that her own mother had once sung. Outside in the city's shadows, Blackthorne and Grimsby counted gold coins, satisfied with the success of their most elaborate plan. But they had underestimated the power of a man determined to save his family, and the web of loyalties that Catherine had woven during her years of kindness and dignity. The Tower of London had never housed a prisoner like Catherine Blackwood. Her presence had transformed the place's grim atmosphere. Hardened guards found themselves whispering respectful greetings, and even other prisoners spoke of her with almost religious reverence. Catherine occupied a small but clean cell, with Thomas always in her arms. The baby seemed to absorb his mother's serenity, rarely crying, as if he understood that his strength was needed for both of them to get through that storm. There were 5 days of interrogations conducted by Lord Ashton, a corpulent and impatient man who clearly expected quick confessions. but Catherine answered every question with crystalline clarity, dismantling each accusation with implacable logic. "Lady Blackwood," Lord Ashton said during the fourth session, his frustration evident. "The evidence is clear. These letters were found in your home, written by your hand." "My lord," Catherine interrupted him softly, Thomas sleeping in her lap. "If you will allow me to demonstrate." She asked for paper and ink, and before everyone's eyes, she wrote a few lines in her true handwriting. The difference from the forged letters was obvious to any attentive observer. "Furthermore," she continued, "the dates of these correspondences coincide exactly with periods when I was visibly pregnant, confined to Thornfield. Dozens of witnesses can confirm my constant presence on the property." It was at that moment that the doors opened dramatically. James entered, accompanied by Mr. Hartwell, the private investigator, carrying a briefcase of documents that would make the difference between life and death. "My lord," James said, his voice echoing with noble authority, "I have brought evidence that will definitively prove my wife's innocence." Lord Ashton frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Lord Blackwood, this is a military court. There is precedent for the truth," James cut him off, approaching Catherine. For a moment their eyes met, and in that look were promises of eternal protection. "Mr. Hartwell opened the briefcase, revealing photographs, documents, and even a person, a nervous, middle-aged man who identified himself as a clerk for Blackthorne and Grimsby. "This man," Hartwell said, "confessed to having falsified the letters at his employer's request in exchange for a substantial sum. Furthermore, we have discovered that Blackthorne and Grimsby have dealings with French agents. They themselves are the true traitors who tried to incriminate Lady Catherine to divert suspicion." The clerk, trembling but determined, confirmed every word. He explained how he had been instructed to copy Catherine's handwriting based on social letters that Blackthorne had managed to obtain through aristocratic contacts. "Even more," James continued, producing another document, "we have managed to prove that the military information contained in the fake letters was already public knowledge, published in the Times a week before the alleged dates of the correspondences." Lord Ashton examined the evidence with growing discomfort. The conspiracy was collapsing before his eyes, like a house of cards touched by the wind. "And where are Messrs. Blackthorne and Grimsby now?" he asked, his voice already revealing the change in his opinion. "Arrested in Dover, trying to board a ship for France with a considerable fortune," Hartwell replied with satisfaction. "It appears that when they realized the plan against the Blackwoods was failing, they decided to flee with all the money they had extorted from other families over the years." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine held Thomas tighter, feeling tears of relief burn in her eyes. James approached slowly, as if he feared she would disappear if he moved too quickly. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It is over," Lord Ashton confirmed, rising solemnly. "Lady Catherine Blackwood, in the name of Her Majesty, I apologize for the embarrassment inflicted upon your family. The accusations are fully withdrawn, and a formal apology will be sent to the House of Lords." When Catherine rose, carrying Thomas, and walked into James's arms, everyone present witnessed something rare, the absolute triumph of truth over lies, of love over hatred, of dignity over slander. But the true victory would only come when they returned to Thornfield, where a new life awaited them, not just as survivors of a terrible storm, but as a family forged in the fire of adversity and tempered by the strength of an unbreakable love. 5 years had passed since that terrible day at the Tower of London. The summer of 1869 found Thornfield Manor transformed into a property that radiated life and hope like a lighthouse on a stormy night. Catherine, now 29, watched from her favourite window the gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. Thomas, now a clever 5-year-old with rebellious hair and curious eyes, ran among the rose bushes chasing golden butterflies. Beside him played Eleanor, a 3-year-old with honey-coloured curls and crystalline laughter, and little Edmund, just 1 year old, who crawled bravely across the soft grass. But it wasn't just her children who filled those gardens with joy. Margaret, Michael and Sophie, 3 orphaned siblings they had taken in 2 years earlier, completed the family that Catherine and James had built with so much love. The mansion constantly echoed with children's voices, footsteps running through the corridors, and that special music that only truly happy homes know. James approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on her shoulder. His hair now had silver threads at the temples, but his eyes still held that oceanic depth that had enchanted her since their first meeting. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he murmured, his voice carrying the intimacy of shared years. The school, Catherine replied, leaning against his chest. It's almost ready. Next week, 50 children from the region will have access to the education they deserve. The school had been a cherished dream of both of them since the early days of their marriage. Now it stood majestically on the grounds of Thornfield, a red brick building with wide windows and sunny rooms, where children from all social classes would learn side by side. Mrs. Fletcher is preparing a feast for the inauguration, James smiled. Aunt Sarah insists on sewing uniforms for all the children, even though she knows many families can provide their own. That's our Sarah, Catherine laughed softly, always taking care of everyone like a second mother. They remained like that for a few minutes, watching their children play in the garden where everything had begun. It was hard to believe that such serene happiness had been born from so much suffering and injustice. Sometimes I still dream about those terrible days, Catherine confessed. I wake up thinking that all of this is just a beautiful dream that's too good to be true. James gently turned her in his arms, looking at her with that intensity that still made her heart race after so many years. Catherine, he said, his hands gently touching her face, you have transformed not only my life, but the lives of hundreds of people. Look around. See how many children have a better future because of your courage. See how our family has grown, how our love has multiplied instead of diminishing. It was true. Thornfield had become a benchmark throughout Surrey for its social initiatives. In addition to the school, they had established a medical clinic for the less fortunate, professional training workshops for young people, and a public library that was the pride of the region. Lady Constance was wrong, James continued, gently kissing her forehead. She thought that birth and title determined a person's worth, but you proved that dignity, kindness, and courage are worth more than all the ancient coats of arms in the world. That afternoon, as they prepared for a family dinner, Catherine received a letter that deeply moved her. It was from Lord Pembrokeshire, the judge who had condemned Lady Constance years before. Dear Lady Catherine, I write to inform you that your story has inspired significant changes in our legislation. Thanks to your case, new laws have been passed protecting citizens against false accusations and ensuring more rigorous investigations before criminal proceedings. Your suffering was not in vain. Thousands of people will benefit from your courage in seeking the truth. That night, after all the children had been put to bed, Catherine and James walked through the gardens under the full moon. The roses she had planted in her first days as mistress of Thornfield now formed a fragrant paradise that stretched to the horizon. Do you have any regrets? James asked, intertwining his fingers with hers. Catherine stopped by the rose garden where they had shared their first moment of true closeness. She thought of everything they had faced, the false accusations, the prison, the exile, the slander, the fear. She also thought of everything they had won, an unbreakable love, a wonderful family, the ability to turn pain into hope. None, she replied with absolute conviction. Every tear shed, every moment of terror, every night of uncertainty. Everything was worth it to get here, to this garden, to this family, to this love we feel. James kissed her then, under the stars that had witnessed so many love stories over the centuries. It was a kiss that carried the promise of all the tomorrows they would still share, of all the storms they would face together, of all the gardens they would still plant. When they separated, Catherine looked once more at Thornfield Manor, its lit windows revealing glimpses of the life that was bustling inside. It was more than a house. It was living proof that true love can blossom even in the most arid soils, and that human dignity is a force more powerful than any injustice. Let's go home, she whispered, and in those simple words was contained all the magic of a life built on the solid foundations of true love, unshakable courage, and eternal hope. In the garden, the roses continued to exhale their fragrance into the night breeze, whispering to future generations the story of Catherine and James Blackwood, a story that proved once again that true love always finds a way to blossom, no matter how harsh the winter it must cross.